Majestic, powerful, and deadly. For over 400 years, British ships ruled the waves. These magnificent vessels helped shape history across the globe. I'm Rob Bell, and in this series, I'll be exploring 6 of the world's greatest ships. In this episode, I discover the extraordinary story of the Golden Hind, the first English ship to sail around the globe. Sir Francis Drake's epic voyage was marked by daring, violence, and betrayal. Yet the Golden Hind also set Britain on a path to becoming the world's greatest sea power. On the 13th of December 1577, a small group of ships set sail from the south coast of England. At their head was the ship we now know as the Golden Hind. Most of the men on board thought they were bound for Alexandria, a short and peaceful trip across the Mediterranean. But anyone who knew their captain might have guessed that their real mission was very different. Today, Sir Francis Drake is celebrated as the great British hero who helped defeat the Spanish Armada of 1588. By then, he was a Knight of the Realm and Vice Admiral of the English fleet. He couldn't have been more respectable. But 11 years previously, when he was captain of the Golden Hind, he'd enjoyed a rather different kind of fame as one of England's most notorious pirates. In the early 1570s, Drake took part in a series of daring raids against the American colonies of Britain's great rival, Philip II, King of Spain. Drake plundered immense amounts of gold from the Caribbean by shamelessly stealing from Spanish treasure ships. Having been stung once, the Spanish were now on the lookout for another English raid in the Caribbean. So in 1577, Queen Elizabeth gave her secret approval for Drake's most daring plan yet. To surprise the Spanish, Drake wouldn't simply cross the Atlantic and raid the Caribbean again. He would do something no Englishman had ever done before: head south down the coast of South America and become the first English mariner to sail from the Atlantic to the Pacific. The plan was so bold that Drake hoped to catch the Spanish treasure ships here, completely unprepared.
When you think of an Elizabethan ship capable of sailing halfway around the world, you might picture some giant, towering galleon, bristling with cannons, ready to take on the fiercest of enemy ships, and so large it could ride out even the biggest ocean storms. So when you see the ship that Drake chose to lead his mission up close, you might be in for a bit of a surprise.
Even by Elizabethan standards, the Golden Hind was a small ship. This replica, moored on London's South Bank, is built to the approximate dimensions of the original ship. At barely 100 feet long and 20 feet wide, it's astonishing to think a vessel this size sailed all the way around the world. So why did Drake commission such a modest ship for such a hazardous voyage? To find out more, I've come to meet the man in charge of restoring this replica, Toby Millender.
I hope you don't mind me saying, but I think one of my first impressions is just how kind of stripped back a design Golden Hind is. I mean, why is she so small?
Well, she's known as a race-built galleon, which was a design preferred by the English. They were a lot more manoeuvrable as opposed to the Spanish galleons, which were massive. They were designed to carry treasure and to sink ships, whereas we were designed to basically board ships and stay out of range of them
I can't see any lifeboats up there at all. What would have happened if someone had fallen overboard?
In calm conditions, they would have sent out a boat or thrown them a line, but in heavy seas, they were pretty much done for. They couldn't really swim, a lot of the mariners at that time, and it was almost seen as you would defy the sea if you did learn to swim. I've always thought it's good to sail with sailors that can't swim because they're less likely to sink the boat. So, yeah.
That's an interesting thought. I will bear that in mind for any future excursions on the sea.
The planks on the original hull of the Golden Hind would have been made of oak. And to fix replacement planks on this replica, Toby's using ancient shipbuilding techniques.
How did the original shipbuilders build the hull and ensure it was watertight?
They would have used trennels to hold the planks on. It means tree nail, so that's a piece of oak.
So this is a tree nail or...
Tree nail, yeah.
Trennel.
Yeah.
The use of trennels in shipbuilding goes back over 7,000 years.
Nice.
Because the nails are made of wood, they expand and contract with the planks around them, keeping the structure incredibly tight.
That's it.
Jobs are good, look at that. Lovely. They would have been using the same techniques as we've seen there.
Exactly the same technique, yeah.
When it was originally built.
Once the ship was built, it was time for Drake to recruit his crew. But here he faced a big problem. England was full of Spanish spies. If Drake told his recruits of his daring plan to attack Spanish treasure ships on the Pacific coast, there was every chance that word would get back to the Spanish authorities. This would not only rob him of the element of surprise, but could even spark an open war between Spain and England.
Drake's solution was simple. He lied. He told his men they were on a short diplomatic mission to Alexandria in Egypt.
Had the men known where they were really going, many might have had second thoughts. In the Elizabethan era, transatlantic voyages were notoriously hazardous. If you didn't die by drowning or disease, then there was always being killed in combat by the Spanish, or meeting a grisly end at the hands of hostile natives. But once he reached the Mediterranean, Drake had to reveal that these were all dangers his men now faced.
It's likely many of his crew were furious. One sailor remarked that he would rather have been hanged in England than come on this voyage.
To stop his men deserting from this new hazardous mission, Drake may have needed to draw on his own humble origins.
Francis Drake is basically a simple seaman. He doesn't come from a high-born family. He is not a gentleman originally. So therefore he has to prove himself in terms of his professional ability. And therefore people would work for him. And even if he was misleading them as to where they were going, like he did on this voyage, he was able to keep them on board, quite literally, and they would go wherever he took them.
Once Drake had persuaded his crew to stay on board, he could embark on his true mission, raiding Spanish ships in the Americas. Having first sailed from Plymouth to the coast of North Africa, he finally began his journey westward across the Atlantic. Yet reaching the New World could take over a month. So what was life like for the crew on this perilous crossing?
On a small ship like this, space is at a premium. There's only one private cabin on the ship, and that was this, Drake's own. And pretty much the most luxurious aspect of this small room was this, the door. On a vessel of this size, there's simply no privacy.
Inside may not have been that luxurious, but Drake used his time in here to try and relax.
Apparently, one of Drake's favourite pastimes in the evenings was to make drawings of the places he'd seen on his voyage. In an age well before photography, this was a vital way of preserving what he'd learnt about the new lands he'd visited. And we can also deduce another of Drake's favourite pastimes from his crew list. Alongside soldiers and sailors, a shoemaker and a surgeon, Drake recruited string players and trumpeters to play music on board. If he'd ever invited them in here for a private performance, it certainly would have been an intimate gig.
If you think Drake's living quarters look a little on the small side, wait until you see where the rest of the crew slept. The vast majority of the men on board shared a single space below deck. Richard Blakemore is an expert on what life would have been like for the men sharing these appallingly cramped conditions.
Whereabouts on the ship are we here now?
We're down here in the gun deck, and the clue is sort of in the name. This is where the 18 cannons that were carried on board would have sat and would have been used.
All around us here now?
Absolutely, but it's also where most of the crew would have slept and spent a lot of time.
How many men would have been sleeping down here then?
Well, there's a crew of about 80, so we're thinking probably about 60 men would be based
60?
down here. But only about half of the crew would have been down here at any one time because of the watch system.
So can you tell me what a typical routine might have been in the day for these sailors?
They had a very strict timetable in order to make the ship work, and they kept time with hourglasses like this one. So these would normally measure about half an hour, and 8 glasses or 4 hours was one watch.
So at the same time as it being an operational part of the deck, you would have had people trying to get some shut-eye here as well. So how were they doing it? It wasn't quiet or dark for you to sleep.
No, it absolutely wasn't quiet or dark. I mean, I think one of the things about this deck is just how noisy it would be. If we think of the sort of feet running around above deck with all the crew who are running up the rigging, but also if you think about the ship at sea, pitching and tossing, the sounds of the ocean all around.
Well, life on board really doesn't sound very pleasant. In fact, it sounds horrendous most of the time. So why would these sailors ever have agreed to go on this voyage, especially as they weren't conscripted?
Well, I think the first place we have to start with that question is the fact that society at that time was not a safe place. You could catch the plague in London. Life expectancy is not good. So for people of this social status, staying at home is not necessarily that much better than coming out on the ships.
One thing that was definitely worse at sea than on land was food. Mark Hawtrey is an expert on the diet that most Elizabethan sailors would have had to contend with.
On Drake's voyage in the Golden Hind, what would they be eating? What was their kind of staple diet on board?
Well, standard naval rations for them, and right through into the 18th century, tends to be a couple of pounds of salt pork or salt fish, and rather than bread, which will go off very quickly, get damp, then we have ship's biscuit, hardtack.
Right, OK. So what is hardtack exactly?
That's wholemeal flour made up to a paste with water and salt, and then baked at least twice to dry it, to make it really, really hard.
That was the point, was it, to try and keep everything dry?
Yes, definitely. Do you want to try some?
That's really hard, Mark.
It is.
I can't actually... Can you staff a bit?
No. There you go.
Right, I've got a tiny bit off. Now I'm going to try and eat that. My jaw.
And this is the point where I tell you, they never ate them dry like that.
Right, OK.
These are usually dropped into a stew to make it almost like a dumpling.
Oh, brilliant. Thanks. I don't blame them for not getting involved in that, because that's hard going. It's not overly flavoursome either.
To make matters worse, damp storage conditions could attract some unwelcome visitors.
What have we got here?
We've got some weevils.
Weevils. Oh, these guys.
Weevils were notorious for laying their eggs in damp biscuit, leaving their larvae to gnaw through the hardtack.
There's common sailor stories about having to knock the weevils out or drop those into hot liquids to try and float the larvae to the surface.
So even if a piece of hardtack there was infested with weevils, would they still eat that?
Yes, we're very used to having lots of food, and so we worry about what our food tastes like. Whereas if you're hungry, you eat.
Yeah.
Even if it's got weevils in it, you might disregard it as extra protein.
With sailors often in poor health, It's little wonder they frequently had problems with their guts. It meant that one particular part of the ship got some all too frequent use.
Now this is the beakhead, a small space right at the front of the ship. And these open slats in the floor here give you a bit of a hint as to what this space was used for, because this was the ship's toilet. Now, while the facilities on modern-day ships may be somewhat more sophisticated, they do have one thing in common with this early prototype. Even today, sailors still refer to the toilets on ships as the heads, named after the original beakhead on a ship like this.
It wasn't only physical conditions that caused problems for Drake's crew. Living for months at sea in cramped conditions could also cause the psychological relationships between the men on board to unravel.
One of Drake's closest friends on board was a nobleman who'd worked in the court of Queen Elizabeth, Thomas Doughty. He'd been crucial in winning her backing for the mission. Yet, over the course of their transatlantic voyage, the relationship between the two friends deteriorated. It was rumoured that Doughty had openly questioned Drake's authority in front of his men, raising the prospect of a mutiny.
If the threat of open rebellion amongst his men wasn't bad enough, Drake was soon to learn that this potential mutiny had an unusually dark inspiration.
Some said that Doughty and his brother had openly boasted about being able to raise the devil and to transform themselves into the likeness of a lion or bear. For Drake, it meant just one thing. At the heart of his crew, he had a witch.
Today, it may be hard to imagine that Drake could have seriously believed that his old friend was a devil-worshipping shapeshifter. Yet, for Elizabethan sailors, witchcraft was all too real.
Amongst ordinary people on the ground, belief in witchcraft was absolutely endemic during Elizabeth's reign. Their mental world was very, very different from ours. I mean, I think that the great majority of them, probably almost all of them, would absolutely have believed in the reality of witchcraft and in the ability of witches to cause big problems for mariners. There are stories, for example, of fires starting at sea in an unexplained way, which are attributed to witchcraft, of ships sinking in fair weather, which is again attributed to the power of witches. There are stories even of witches having been seen in the topmast of a ship, actually, conjuring up storms on the ship itself.
Given the strong link in the Elizabethan mind between witches and shipwrecks, what happened next may have sealed Doughty's fate. Soon after Drake reached what is now Argentina, he was hit by a freak storm that scattered his flotilla. Drake drew a shocking conclusion. Doughty was not only a would-be mutineer, but a witch who'd raised the storm himself. In the strained pressure cooker atmosphere of a small ship, Drake's outlandish claim seemed terrifyingly plausible.
If you imagine, just how cramped the quarters were for the sailors on that trip, just how little space they would have had, and at the same time there's this lurking sense of menace. We're heading out into unknown waters. Once these rumours of witchcraft, of an expedition that is dogged by occult forces begins to spread, it's easy to imagine what a terrible atmosphere would have grown up on that ship.
While he decided what to do with him, Drake had Doughty tied to the Hind mast here to roast in the harsh sunlight.
Drake may have considered charging Doughty with witchcraft, but in the end, he decided it would be easier to convict him on a separate charge of attempted mutiny. In the harbour of San Julian, Drake convened an impromptu trial.
The jury was unanimous and Doughty was found guilty. For Drake, there was only one sentence for a crime of this kind: death.
Yet Doughty's reaction to the news he was going to be killed was somewhat unexpected.
The story goes that after sentence had been pronounced on Doughty, far from sort of, violently protesting his innocence or falling on Drake as you might have expected him to, the two men actually agreed to take the sacrament together and then to actually sit down and have sort of a final meal. I wonder if the truth is that right up to the last minute, Doughty doesn't really believe that he will be executed. This was something that happened a lot in the early modern period. People would be tried, condemned to death, and then at the very last minute, when they are led up to the place of execution, a pardon will be brought in and they will be spared.
2nd of July, 1578. On a barren stretch on the coast of what is now Argentina, Drake prepared for his grisliest task yet: executing his old friend Thomas Doughty for the crime of mutiny.
The spot chosen for Doughty's execution had a macabre past. In the natural harbour of San Julian, some 60 years previously, the Portuguese explorer Magellan had also executed some of his men for attempted mutiny. It seems that on both voyages, the hardship of that transatlantic crossing proved a fertile breeding ground for rebellion. And it was on this same shore that Doughty was to meet his death. Doughty knelt, prayed for his queen and for the success of Drake's mission, and then bowed his head. After the blade fell, Drake raised his severed head and cried, "Lo, this is the end of traitors."
Drake's execution of a fellow gentleman cast a long shadow over later mutinies. It set the precedent that a ship's captain had absolute power over all his crew, regardless of rank.
With the mutiny behind him, Drake could concentrate on the most challenging part of his entire voyage, crossing from the Atlantic to the Pacific.
To fulfill his mission of plundering Spanish treasure ships in the Pacific, you'd think Drake could have simply sailed round Cape Horn, the very southern tip of South America. At the time, however, it was thought that a giant landmass, Terra Australis, blocked any passage between the two oceans. The only sea route known to Drake was the treacherous Magellan Straits, a winding waterway that cuts through the tip of South America. At that time, the only man who had ever sailed through the straits was the mariner after whom they were named, the Portuguese explorer Ferdinand Magellan. In 1522, his ship had gone on to become the first ever to complete an entire circumnavigation of the globe. Yet to follow in Magellan's illustrious footsteps, Drake faced a daunting task.
Even today, sailing through the Straits of Magellan takes considerable skill, but in Drake's day it would have been even harder. The only navigational tools an Elizabethan mariner would have had were instruments like this cross staff here, or slightly more sophisticated, the astrolabe, both used to measure the distance between the horizon and the midday sun, so you could calculate your latitude. But what you really need, if you're going to safely sail through a narrow waterway like the Magellan Straits, is a good map. Now, even if Drake had had one of the most accurate maps of the time drawn up by one of Magellan's crew, it would only have looked something like this. As you can see, it's not that accurate. The Straits of Magellan here has been rendered virtually as a straight line through there. And if you compare that to a map from 200 years later, it doesn't include any of these small islets and inlets that you could easily have crashed into, potentially smashing the ship to smithereens. It means that even if Drake had had the most accurate map that was available, it would have been virtually useless. When he entered the Straits of Magellan, he was essentially sailing blind.
Drake's passage through the Straits was far from easy. The winds went against him, blowing him towards rocks and landlocked inlets where he almost ran aground. At one point, the ship was even hit by a roaring tornado that caused the sea to swell upward on every side. At last, however, on the 6th of September 1578, Drake reached the Pacific.
What had taken Magellan 37 days back in 1520, Drake achieved in just 14. And as the first Englishman ever to sail from the Atlantic to the Pacific, Drake could now apply himself to the true purpose of his mission: piracy.
The Spanish New World colonies were a source of vast wealth. The assault by the conquistadors on the indigenous empires of America had yielded huge amounts of silver and gold, all loaded onto galleons ready to be shipped home to Europe. Yet capturing these ships intact wouldn't be easy. Elizabethan naval combat often relied on sinking ships at distance with cannon fire. But to capture their treasure, Drake needed to board enemy ships. To discover what kind of tactics Drake might have used in preparing for this close-quarters combat, I've come to Portland Castle. Paul Pattison is an expert in Elizabethan naval combat.
When you think of Drake's voyage on the Golden Hind and the kind of encounters he was having with the Spanish ships, it wasn't all about large artillery. It was small arms fire, was it?
Yeah, especially when you come to that crucial time of you're going to board a ship. You need to clear the decks of enemy sailors and enemy defenders.
As you're coming in close?
Yeah.
And it was this weapon here was the weapon of choice for that, was it?
That's exactly right. It's called a matchlock musket. And it's called a matchlock because it uses match, which is this length of rope-like material, which is soaked in a solution which makes it burn very, very slowly.
Ah,
okay.
So that when that was lit, that was called the match?
That's the match.
Once lit, the match worked as a smouldering wick to light the gunpowder. Yet making this complex device ready to fire was no quick and easy process.
Okay, loaded.
So that's when you put the match, which is burning, in the correct position. Yeah. In the jaws there.
Oh, I see.
You wrap the rest around so it's out of the way. Open the pan. And then when you pull the trigger, the match comes onto the burning pan, ignites that powder, gun fires.
Bang.
Bang.
It's a bit fiddly, isn't it?
Well, actually, yes. And that's why it's not a good boarding weapon, because you fire it once and then you're exposed.
After my brief musketry masterclass, it's time to put theory into practice.
All right, Paul, so open the pan and then pull the trigger. Simple as that. All right, take aim. Let's do it. It's right in your face.
Firing a gun like this for myself is a reminder that correctly loading and aiming a matchlock musket during a messy sea battle would have taken considerable skill.
That's quite fun, firing that in this calm environment, but imagining that on Golden Hind in the heat of the battle, I mean, it's a completely different scenario.
People firing back.
People firing back.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The matchlock musket wasn't the only weapon used to clear the decks of an enemy ship during boarding. Sailors on board ships like the Golden Hind would also have used bows and arrows. But before they could take aim, the archers first had to make a perilous journey.
The best vantage point for giving covering fire was right up there on the fighting tops. Now, from there you could get a clear shot at sailors both on enemy ships alongside as well as anyone trying to board the Hind itself. But getting up there wasn't easy. There's no ladders or stairways here. Sailors would have had to climb up the ropes at speed, carrying their weapons. Now I've got way more safety equipment than they would have had, so I'm gonna hoik up there myself, try and see what it was like. Now this may not look that high, but let me assure you, it certainly feels it. Especially when you look out over the bow of the ship there, it is a long way down. But having to climb up here without any kind of safety equipment, carrying my weapon, possibly being shot at, you'd have needed nerves of steel.
For the crew charged with this daunting task, it looked like they'd soon get a chance to put their skills to the test. As she sailed up the Pacific coast, the Golden Hind was finally ready to fulfill her primary mission: robbing unsuspecting Spanish treasure ships.
Drake found a treasure ship going up the west coast, nicknamed the Cacafuego. It is often translated by historians as Spitfire. Actually, you have to change the letter. It was fire. Cacafuego was a big, large carrack with high bow, high stern, but, crucially, virtually unarmed. Whereas Drake's ship was an armed small galleon, very maneuverable, very well armed, and with a lot of people on board who were capable of boarding and entering the other ship.
Yet in this encounter, Drake's main weapon wasn't force of arms, but stealth.
The key point in this incident is that the Spanish are not expecting a piratical ship or an enemy warship to be anywhere in the vicinity. So therefore they can be taken completely by surprise. When Drake spots the Spanish ship, he tries to disguise his presence. He has some of the Spanish speakers on board say that he's not who he is. When it seems clear to the Spaniards that he is who he is, then he opens fire. The ship is boarded from two sides, and the still slightly nonplussed Spanish crew, who weren't expecting any hostile ships in the vicinity, are rapidly overcome.
When Drake hauled the treasure from the Cacafuego back on board the Golden Hind, he couldn't believe his eyes.
Now this is the hold where Drake would have stored all his loot from the Cacafuego, and there was a lot of it to store. From that one ship alone, he took away 26 tons of silver bars, 13 chests full of silver coins, 80 pounds of gold, and pile upon pile of jewels and pearls. There was so much of it, it took Drake and his men 4 days to transfer it all onto the Hind. Over the course of his voyage, Drake picked up so much booty. He even had to pull up the floor of the hold here, throw the existing ballast overboard and replace it with silver. On its return journey, the Golden Hind had become one giant nautical treasure store.
For Drake, the capture of the Cacafuego was a huge triumph, but the Spanish were now on high alert. It meant that if he returned the way he came, he would almost certainly encounter Spanish ships out for revenge. It was a challenge that was to inspire his greatest achievement yet. With the Golden Hind now groaning under the weight of Spanish gold, Drake had completed the secret mission that had inspired his voyage. Now all he needed to do was find his way home.
Perhaps Drake's most famous feat is being the first Englishman to circumnavigate the globe. What's less well known is that this is something he never intended to do. The most obvious route home for him would have been back the way he came, through the Magellan Straits, but he was worried that the Spanish would be waiting here for him. So instead, he decided to sail north to find the fabled Northwest Passage across the top of North America and then back across the Atlantic. It was only when he failed to find this that he took the step that would seal his place in history. As a last resort, he decided to sail west across the Pacific. And this would mean becoming the first Englishman ever to sail all the way around the world.
This bold new route also gave Drake another opportunity to fill his coffers. On his way were the legendary Spice Islands. It was here that Drake would discover his richest prize yet.
The Moluccas were islands in the East Indies where it was known spices came from. And given the lack of ability to preserve meat and other things at that time, spices were absolutely crucial to make things edible. And therefore spices were very valuable indeed.
When Drake arrived at the islands, he received a surprisingly warm welcome.
When Golden Hind approaches the coast, he's met by some large canoes containing a welcoming party of musicians. Drake himself had an orchestra on board. He seems to be being quite musical. And so therefore we have this exchange of music and this exchange of confidence that in fact the whole thing is going to go extremely well. Drake meets the local ruler, who has the nickname Babu, and some sources say gets on quite well with him.
Soon, this unlikely friendship led to a business deal.
Drake picked up a large cargo of cloves. They were extremely valuable, perhaps worth more than their weight in gold. If you could bring cloves back, you were going to get very rich indeed.
With his hold full of treasure and spices, it was finally time for Drake to return home. Sailing across the Indian Ocean, he rounded the southern tip of Africa in June 1580. And on the 26th of September, 3 years after he'd left England, he arrived at Plymouth Sound with his 59 remaining crew. Considering what he'd achieved, you'd have thought he'd have been ecstatic, preparing himself for a hero's welcome. In fact, he was terrified.
Drake had gone out with the secret covert support of Elizabeth. If she wasn't in power when he came home, he might be in deep trouble. Even worse, as he'd been carrying on something of an anti-Catholic crusade, if Mary Queen of Scots, a Catholic successor, was now in power, he would be in very deep trouble indeed.
When the Golden Hind finally approached the English south coast, she was met by a small fleet of fishing boats. Having called out to their crews, Drake was relieved to discover that the reigning monarch was still Queen Elizabeth.
After Drake sent word to the Queen of his successful voyage, he faced an anxious wait for her reply. He knew she was in a delicate situation. By this time, word had got back to Spain of Drake's piracy, and Philip II was furious. If Elizabeth was seen to publicly condone Drake's actions, it could spark a war. Finally, however, the wait was over. The Queen asked Drake to meet her, bringing samples of his labours, and Drake was only too happy to oblige.
Drake's booty was eventually stored here at the Tower of London. The stash of gold, silver and jewels that he presented to the Queen was estimated by one contemporary historian to be worth over £320,000. well over £65 million in modern money. I've come to meet Tudor historian Joanne Poole to find out how this vast haul transformed the fortunes of both Elizabeth and Drake.
What did Elizabeth then do with all this wealth that she'd been brought?
A lot of it went to pay off her foreign debt from various wars and so on. Some of it went to continuing exploration under the British Crown and really, in some sense, founding the sort of British Empire.
Drake was now a wealthy man, but he wasn't yet famous in quite the way he might have wished.
Elizabeth and her sort of spin doctors put it around that Drake's mission had failed entirely, that it had brought nothing back, that it hadn't circumnavigated the globe, that he'd come back essentially in ruin, in order to put the Spanish off the case.
That must have been enormously frustrating for him to have it come back and not be able to be celebrated publicly. Did Queen Elizabeth ever publicly acknowledge Drake's achievements?
Yeah, it took her a little while to do so, but she did. Elizabeth came down to Deptford. The Golden Hind had been placed there as a sort of monument to Drake's success. They all gathered there. Elizabeth hands this beautiful jeweled sword to the French ambassador and has him do the knighting ceremony in this sort of public performance of French support for Drake's exploits.
At a stroke, Drake the pirate had become Drake the national hero. The real Golden Hind has long since rotted away, but her legend lives on. Few British ships have ever seen such adventure, from daring acts of piracy to the threat of mutiny, and the first circumnavigation of the globe by an Englishman. The voyage of the Golden Hind showed how England could project her power far beyond her borders, to lands undreamt of just a generation before.
It meant that this small ship not only helped lay the foundation of empire, but also set Britain on a path towards eventually becoming the world's greatest naval power.
Extraordinary, iconic, lethal. These incredible ships have told our story for the past 400 years and defined what it means to be part of our island nation. I'm Rob Bell, and in this series, I'll be exploring Britain's greatest ships. In this episode, I discover the amazing story of HMV Endeavour, a humble coal bark from Yorkshire that transformed our understanding of the world.
They were going to places that people hadn't been to before, and there was always a sense that something exciting was going to turn up.
With her famous Captain James Cook, she sailed to the edge of the earth to reveal a world of mystery and wonder. Endeavour was a ship like no other. So how did she end up in a watery grave off the east coast of America? In the 18th century, Britain was competing with her European rivals to claim as much of the world as possible, and Britain was surging ahead.
Of all the famous ships associated with exploration and empire building, few are more revered than Endeavour.
A ship that changed the world.
She was sent to the other side of the globe on 2 missions for king and country. one of them top secret. They would make the ship and her captain, James Cook, the stuff of legend.
His first mission was to sail to a remote island in the South Pacific and take a vital astronomical reading of a phenomenon that wouldn't happen again for more than 100 years.
But if this wasn't a big enough deal as it was Cook's other top secret mission that would see him sail his trusty ship into the pages of history.
There had been voyages which went across the Pacific, but generally they went across a narrow belt right in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. So to the north of that, to the south of that, people weren't really sure what was there.
The South Pacific was the last ocean to remain largely unexplored. And Britain wanted to be the first European power to find and exploit its riches.
The Admiralty knew that for a very special mission, they'd need a very special ship. So what would they choose to take on the unknown dangers on the other side of the world? A mighty galleon or a speedy naval frigate, perhaps? Nope. They chose a coal ship.
This is a full-size replica of Endeavour, whose story started here in Whitby as a bark carrying coal from Tyneside to London.
You can see from the shape that it's all about carrying large loads. It's a strong, wide ship with this blunt bow and a broad rear end. And with only 3 masts, her rigging was light compared to a long-distance cruiser. Let's face it, she's no ocean-going swan. But to the Admiralty and to Cook, she had hidden charms. Now, don't take this the wrong way, but she was shallow, with a flat bottom.
This made her much more versatile than many of the Navy's other vessels. A battleship like HMS Victory had a massive keel, which stopped her from capsizing during a storm. But she couldn't be landed on a beach or tipped onto her side and repaired, all of which you can do with a flat-bottomed boat.
The Admiralty was clearly expecting Endeavour to come in for a bit of rough treatment. And in the 18th century, if you needed a tough vessel for a tough job, you'd be well advised to put a ship made in Whitby at the top of your list. They had a reputation for being exceptionally strong.
Even then, the Admiralty spent nearly £6,000 upgrading her for the mission ahead, almost 3 times as much as it had cost to build her.
A false keel was added and extra planks nailed to the hull to protect against tropical seaworm eating away at the wood. This was then covered in copper sheeting to prevent barnacles and seaweed growing on the hull that would cause drag in the water. Finally, 6 4-pounder cannons were added on deck, with 4 more below. Endeavour was ready for action. The ship wasn't the only unusual choice for this top-level mission for king and country. The captain himself would be plucked from relative obscurity.
James Cook was the son of a farm labourer. He moved to Whitby when he was just 17 to become a ship's apprentice. The house he lived in is now a museum, and this attic is where he used to sleep.
It feels like we're right in the middle of the harbour here, because there's a lot of noise. Can I have a quick look to see? Get my bearings a little bit here. So,
You're right in the heart of all the action here in Whitby then. There was no escaping it.
Yes. There were shipyards, dry docks, rope walks, provisioning merchants, carpenters, you name it, all the way up both sides of the river.
As well as all those merchant ships in and out all the time.
Yes. At the time that Cook came here, there were at least 250 ships owned by Whitby men.
Many were colliers, carrying coal and timber along the east coast and to ports as far afield as St. Petersburg. It was on boats like these that Cook would spend the next 9 years, learning how to navigate and handle a ship in the tricky North Sea. These were all skills which gave him an advantage when he joined the Royal Navy, and he rose quickly through its ranks.
Writing in his journal as a junior Navy officer, Cook stated his ambition to go further than any man had gone before. There's no doubt that Cook was a master of the art of sailing. And if he ever had any doubts about the success of his missions or the ship he was given, he never showed them. But as a captain, would he be able to sail a coal ship off the map to the other side of the world? In August 1768, Cook set sail from Plymouth for the other side of the world in a packed ship. The Navy's choice of vessel for the mission, a coal bark, worked on paper. It was strong, could carry lots, and it could be beached without a port. But with her new adventures as Endeavour, she would carry a very different type of burden.
This model of a coal bark shows how tricky it would be to cram in over 90 men into a space that's little more than 100 feet long. There were officers and able-bodied seamen on board, as well as a carpenter, a sailmaker, a surgeon, and a gunner. Stuffed into the hold was enough food for 18 months. Flour, beer, salt beef, and sauerkraut, along with 24 chickens and a herd of sheep.
So if you think about how small that ship is, it's really like the size of a small village, packed all together.
But despite all these men and animals living in such close proximity, it worked surprisingly well.
One of the things that Cook was really good at, he was quite a good manager of people. So they used to think of ships as being either happy ships or unhappy ships, and I think Endeavour was generally quite a happy ship.
What set Endeavour apart were the 11 men on board who weren't sailors, but scientists and artists who were there to record the natural world. The best known was Joseph Banks, one of the wealthiest men in England. He was a botanist and always up for an adventure.
They were going to places that people hadn't really been to before, and there was always a sense that something exciting was going to turn up, that they might see something like they did when they got to Australia, when they saw the kangaroo, or when they were coming to New Zealand and they saw these strange birds that they'd never seen or heard before. So they had the scientists, they had the sailors, you had Cook managing it, but it functioned surprisingly well.
Looking after his men was only one of the challenges Cook faced. He first had to find his way across the world's largest and deepest ocean.
It would all be down to his highly skilled navigation to ensure that Endeavour stayed on course and stayed afloat. So how do you navigate a vast open ocean like the Pacific when the landmarks, if there are any, haven't been drawn onto a map yet?
One of the key bits of navigation equipment in the 18th century was something called a sextant, and it would look something like this. Its basic principle is that it allows you to measure the angle between two fixed points in the sky. So that could be between the horizon and the sun, or the horizon and the North Star. So if I try and measure the angle here between the horizon and the sun at the moment, I'm going to look through here. First, I've got to try and find the sun through the clouds. I've got to try and keep myself steady on a heaving ship. Easier said than done. Line up. So now, if I try and hold that there, right, about there. This allows me to measure that angle. So I've got about 48 degrees there. I then compare 48 degrees and find that on charts of data. And that would give me my latitude, my position around the globe in a north-south direction.
It took 3 weeks to reach Madeira, where Cook would restock before crossing the Atlantic. But even on such a routine stop, anything could go wrong. As they were lowering the anchor, a sailor became entangled with the rope. He was dragged overboard and drowned.
Cook couldn't afford to sail into the unknown without a full crew, but most sailors would have been quite wary about signing up to a mission that might have been dangerous. Back in the 18th century, though, there was a simple solution to this kind of problem. Cook and his men identified a likely-looking American sailor on the dockside, kidnapped him, and then set sail immediately so he had no chance to escape. It's a practice known as Shanghaiing, so called because Shanghai is where many of these abducted sailors ended up.
Being forced to join a ship was just one of the many occupational hazards for a sailor during the 18th century. If the sea didn't kill you, disease often did. And one of the biggest killers was a lack of vitamin C, which caused scurvy.
It was a terrible disease, not just the effect that it had physically. We know about people's teeth falling out and their gums swelling up and becoming, kind of physically weakened and dying. The other thing is its psychological effects on the human brain, which is almost a bit like a psychedelic trip in a way. So you'll get these really strange stories of sailors seeing blood red sea, or scaring with fright at the smell of some flowers, or seeing things in intense greens. And this again is a scurvied mind trying to interpret reality.
It caused so many deaths that captains often sailed with twice as many men as they needed because they expected to lose half their crew.
With the Pacific being so far away, was scurvy a kind of barrier to exploring the unknown?
Yeah, absolutely, because of just the sheer size of it. Once you're at sea, the longer you're away from a port, the more likely you are to suffer from scurvy.
It took 8 long weeks to cross the Atlantic. But when Cook arrived at Rio de Janeiro for much-needed supplies, the Portuguese viceroy refused to let him dock.
Endeavour looked like a cargo ship, and the viceroy suspected Cook of being either a smuggler or a spy. This was serious. If Cook couldn't replenish his stocks, they wouldn't be able to go any further. And as they waited, another sailor fell overboard and drowned. It took the Portuguese more than 3 weeks to let Cook buy what he needed. And then, as Endeavour finally got underway, a cannon was fired across its bow, delaying them for another 2 days.
On the 7th of December, Endeavour finally left Portuguese waters and headed towards the tip of South America.
Now, Cook faced the biggest challenge of his voyage so far, Cape Horn. Today, it's known as the Everest of sailing, and it's no exaggeration. 3 mighty oceans, the Atlantic, the Pacific, and the Antarctic, all coming together at the tip of South America, creating powerful currents, unpredictable winds, and huge waves.
Cook had deliberately chosen a vessel with a shallow keel. But a deep keel is exactly what's needed to keep a ship on course in high seas.
There were still miles of the Pacific to cross to get to Tahiti for the astronomical survey. Cook must have wondered if the choice of ship would deal a fatal blow to his mission after all.
After Cook rounded the Cape, the winds pushed him further and further south into rain, mists, and squalling seas. The only signs of life were the albatrosses. All he could do was wait until the winds changed and pushed his ship northwards, towards Tahiti. On the 13th of April 1769, Endeavour finally reached its shores. After a grueling 8 months at sea, it must have seemed like paradise.
Endeavour was only the second British ship to reach Tahiti. HMS Dolphin had landed there the year before, and it hadn't gone well. The Tahitians were terrified at the sight of their first European ship and threw stones at it. The British retaliated by firing cannons back at them. Cook was determined to avoid a repeat of this first awful encounter.
This time, good relations with the Tahitians were vital. Nothing could be allowed to interfere with the mission, to try and understand the workings of the solar system. Scientists from all over Europe would be stationed in far-flung parts of the world to witness this rare astronomical event.
What is the transit of Venus?
In simplest terms, it's when the planet Venus passes across the face of the Sun. By getting a good observation of this, and not just one observation, but lots of observations from different dispersed places on the planet, they would be able to solve one of the greatest problems in astronomy at the time, which is the exact mathematical understanding of the dimensions of the solar system. How far away are we from the Sun? Now, for the enlightened mind, that was a centrally important question.
If they didn't succeed, it would be over 100 years before they could try again. Cook built an observation site on the north of the island. But when it came to calculating how long it took for Venus to cross the Sun, an optical illusion meant that Cook missed the first contact. Neither he nor the other observers were able to measure the transit with any accuracy.
It was always going to be imperfect, just because of the technology they had at the time. And Cook, with his mania for precision, you can imagine how this ate away at him.
Cook and his men had sailed for 8 months around the globe, surviving malnutrition, some of the roughest seas in the world, and dodging armed conflicts at foreign ports, only to be thwarted by atmospheric conditions at their once-in-a-century opportunity. Cook and his astronomers must have felt crushed by defeat at this prospect of returning home empty-handed.
But Cook had another mission. This one was entirely British.
And for this, they literally had to sail into the unknown. It wasn't until Endeavour was on the other side of the world that Cook locked his cabin door and opened an envelope that he'd been carrying in secret for over a year. It contained orders, not from the Royal Society, but from the Admiralty, a mission from King George III himself. Cook was to continue deep into the uncharted South Pacific to look for a fabled land they called Terra Australis Incognita, the unknown southern land.
Cook had to tell his men that they weren't going home, and from now on, there wasn't even an accurate map.
For Cook, this would be a challenge like no other. He would be sailing southwest towards Australia, and at the time, people only had a very hazy idea of what Australia actually was. Dutch explorers had travelled its northern and western edges, but they lost interest when they didn't find any women or spices. And as for New Zealand, they thought it was part of the unknown southern land. Up until that point, European ships had only ever approached from the west. Cook would be sailing from the east, and nobody had ever done that before.
Among the maps at the Captain Cook Memorial Museum is one from 1753, which Cook may have taken with him.
So this is pretty much what he had to go on, is it?
That's what he had to go on, yes.
When you see it like this, and you think about this is what they had to navigate with, it's a bit scary, actually, I think.
I think you had to be very confident of your abilities as a seaman and a navigator.
And then how powerful would it be to have the knowledge of what this coastline actually looked like, for possibly for opening up future trade? And it puts in perspective the level of knowledge that there was about the world. You can understand that desire and the drive there would have been for that enlightenment.
But it was a journey fraught with difficulty. The Society Islands were surrounded by jagged coral shoals on which it would be all too easy to run aground. Fortunately, Cook had a navigator on board who knew these islands intimately, a man he'd met in Tahiti called Tupaia.
He's a political refugee from one of the neighbouring Society Islands. And he's there, he's a man of status, great status in the caste system in the Polynesian islands there. And he's got immense knowledge of things like navigation and voyaging. So for a few weeks in the middle of 1769, you have this Whitby coal collier in the middle of the Pacific Ocean being navigated by a Polynesian star navigator.
We're only just beginning to understand how skilled these early Polynesian sailors were. Hundreds of years earlier, they'd sailed east across the vast emptiness of the Pacific to colonize land as far afield as Hawaii, New Zealand, and Easter Island.
And really, if you look at the map, how did people with their canoes and paddles and not the advantages of technology manage to do that?
Tupaia navigated from one island to the other through close observation of the natural world. He read the wind and bird movements and followed the stars, knowledge which had been passed down through the generations. His drawing of the Society Islands is the first ever known Polynesian map of the area. But soon, even Tupaia's knowledge was stretched beyond its limits.
Cook was about to plunge into a part of the world where few had ever ventured. The Admiralty believed that this mysterious southern continent lay directly south of the Society Islands at a latitude of 40 degrees. But when they got there was no sign of land, only, as Cook wrote in his journal, high seas. So he turned his ship northwest and headed towards New Zealand.
Cook and his men had now been at sea for 14 long months. And when they arrived at Poverty Bay, it must have reminded them of England. But they were soon to discover that New Zealand was nothing like the land they'd left behind.
The day after they arrived, Cook, Banks and some of his crew sailed to shore. They could see some of the Maori with long pikes in their hands. Then they did something that Cook had never seen before, an aggressive tribal ritual that Cook described as a dancing war song. This was the first haka ever witnessed by a British crew. But this encounter with the Maori didn't end well. When one of them stole a sword, he was shot dead. And relations with the Maori never really improved for the whole time Cook was in New Zealand.
The Maori were doing what they could to protect their land, and to Cook and his crew, they must have looked formidable. Even their appearance seemed designed to inspire fear, in part because of their tattoos. Cook had come across them before, but never like this.
Andy, do we know much about those early tattoos that were found on the South Pacific Islanders? I mean, do we know if they had any meaning or what they stood for?
We know quite a bit, yeah. We know that, like most primitive art, they stood for the things that surrounded the islanders. So, for example, turtles were a large part of the islanders' life. They also depict waves, they depict the plants that were around them, but crafted in such a way over thousands and thousands of years, so it's developed into its own unique form of art. When Cook and his crew landed, they saw all these painted people, these huge guys who were tattooed head to foot. And when they're tattooed, they have 3 or 4 guys holding them down. If you show any sign of weakness whatsoever, it's the highest form of dishonour. So these sailors, they were rough, tough guys, you know. I think they said to themselves, we can do that. And so not just a badge of we've done this, but a badge of I've been through that.
Yeah, I've been through the pain and got my tattoo.
Absolutely, no problem.
But there's no time today for a full-blown tattoo, so I'm going for a stencil.
Let's just pop this on you. It's not going to hurt at all.
I am intrigued as to how much it hurts, but...
It doesn't. Yeah. That's your stencil.
That's on. So the anchor would signify that
that you've crossed over the Atlantic.
I've crossed over the Atlantic.
You've crossed over the Atlantic.
Well, I have crossed over the Atlantic, but not in a ship.
Yeah. Now I'm curious to see what the needle actually feels like.
That's it.
There you go.
Is that it?
And it is literally as simple and easy as that.
Oh, wow. I don't know what the fuss is about.
There you go.
I didn't need anybody holding me back there.
Well, this is it.
You
just made a fine sailor.
I'm obviously tougher than some of those sailors that went around the world with Cook.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
It's a doddle.
Cook had plenty of opportunities to study the Maori as he sailed around New Zealand. He was the first European to realise that it was 2 separate islands. It took him 6 months to draw the first ever map. 6 months of measuring angles and meticulously mapping every inch of coastline. It was a particular skill of his, and one he'd learned in Newfoundland soon after he joined the Navy.
Well, you can see just how difficult it is. I mean, look at all these inlets and fjords here.
They're sort of fjords or river bases. If you look at there, it says rocks above water and rocks underwater.
Oh, wow.
So this creates, shall we say, the safest possible guide to navigation on a coastline that is shrouded in fog or rain for many months of the year.
Cook was an early pioneer of measuring both on and offshore to give the most accurate results.
He's constantly getting off the ship and taking a small ship round and landing and doing the surveying from on land. It's amazing.
Was this then almost the start of Cook's fearsome reputation as this navigator extreme who was probably better than most, if not anybody knew within the Navy at the time?
It certainly underlies his later, if you like, fearsome reputation. And it's one of the reasons why he was selected to captain Endeavour.
As Cook was mapping New Zealand, Joseph Banks and the other scientists on board were cataloguing the plant and animal life they found on the islands.
They were collecting insects and fish and birds. They took nets with them, fishing hooks, all sorts of things. This was the best equipped scientific voyage that had ever taken place.
But there was also a more mercenary reason for their investigations. Cook had been asked to find suitable places to build British ports. And a port needs 3 things: a natural harbour, wood to repair ships, and fibrous plants to make rope. This they found in abundance.
So what we have here is the large plants of Formium, or New Zealand flax. It was used by indigenous people for things like rope making, nets, baskets, weaving, all those sorts of things. A really, really versatile and useful plant. Nobody had ever seen it in this country. That's the amazing thing about it. Banks didn't just collect plants because they looked pretty. Banks was interested in how indigenous peoples used those plants. He took his time to record all of the things that they were being used for. So he knew how useful these plants were, and he brought back that knowledge with him. So here we have another plant that's caught Joseph Banks' attention. This is a plant from New Zealand. It's called bushman's toilet paper, and obviously had a use. The indigenous peoples took an extract from it and used it as a gum, as to make your breath smell cleaner, but I don't think we'll try that today.
By the end of March 1770, it had been 19 months since they'd left England, and it was time to go home. Cook had 3 options: travel back the way they'd come, head south around Tasmania, or west towards Australia and up its east coast. Along almost 2,000 miles of uncharted coastline, this was the route Cook chose.
When Cook arrived at Botany Bay, he was the first known European ever to land on Australia's eastern seaboard. And it wasn't a particularly auspicious occasion. You can only imagine the horror of the Aboriginal people at the sight of Endeavour, of men fully clothed, carrying weapons they weren't afraid of using. Their spears were no match for the British musket. But Cook had no idea that disaster was waiting, and that it would mean almost the end of Endeavour and her entire crew. After 22 months at sea, Endeavour was finally on her way home. As Cook hugged the shoreline of Australia's eastern seaboard, he had no idea he was sailing so close to one of the world's greatest natural barriers, until he crashed into it.
The Great Barrier Reef stretches for over 1,600 miles. At a few minutes before 11 p.m, Endeavour collided with the reef. The ship stuck fast, water leaked into the hull, and they were 8 miles from the nearest land. Cook would later name this place Cape Tribulation.
After taking the agonising decision to dump valuable cargo, such as cannon and drinking water, overboard, at the next high tide, Endeavour was finally hauled off the reef and floated free, together with a lump of coral the size of a man's fist still plugging the hole. There was no way of telling how long they'd last, navigating their way out of the dangers on the reef. But one of the crewmen, Jonathan Monkhouse, had an ingenious suggestion: to pull a damaged sail packed with old rope under the hull of the ship, a technique known as fothering.
It might sound straightforward, but it's a lot harder to do underwater.
To start off, they needed to create some kind of wadding to pack out the holes. And they'd do that by using anything they had on ship. Rope was normally pretty handy if you tufted that all out and broke it down into its fibres here. They also had animals on board, so things like sheep's wool would have been added into that as well. There we go, just make a bit of a mess really here. Something you could pack into a hole. That'll do for now. Then, to bind all these fibres together, they needed something that was sticky. Sap from trees nearby, maybe, or resin that had come out of the fibres on the ship. Failing that, though, there were animals on board. You could always opt for Old Faithful. A bit of animal dung. Got some of that here, look. So, mash all that up together. Once you had all of this mixture though, grabbing maybe a damaged sail, they'd pack all of this fibrous, sticky, gunky mixture into the sail. And then using ropes, they'd haul it right underneath the hull of the ship. Something like this. So that's right under there. But then, because of the water pressure pushing up onto the sail, this sticky gunk would be pushed and squeezed into the gaps, filling those holes. It's a technique that's still used today.
Their improvised patch kept her afloat for 6 days, until they were able to land her on a riverbank and tip her onto her side, which wouldn't have been possible if she'd had a deeper keel. Once again, the choice of ship in Endeavour was to save the day. When she was on dry land, Cook was able to examine her wrecked hull. The razor-edged coral had sliced through 4 planks of wood and damaged another 3. It would take 7 weeks to repair.
Cook sent some of his men off to hunt. When they came back, they told him about an animal they'd seen that was mouse-coloured and swift of foot. They'd just seen their first kangaroo. Soon afterwards, in the great spirit of 18th century colonial exploration, they shot one and brought it back. Cook noted in his journal that it had excellent meat.
Once Endeavour was seaworthy again, Cook continued northwards. As he rounded the tip of Australia, he claimed the entire east coast for Britain. 18 years later, it became the country's first penal colony, after 11 ships, all carrying convicts, landed at Sydney. Life for the Aboriginal people would never be the same again.
When Endeavour limped into Jakarta, she was leaking badly, and substantial repairs were required before the long journey home. Up until that point, Cook had managed to keep his men healthy, but then it all went horribly wrong. Jakarta was rife with disease, and the crew fell ill with dysentery and malaria. By the time Endeavour left port, 7 of Cook's men had died.
One of those men was Tupaia, the Polynesian star navigator, who'd done so much to guide Cook on his journey across the South Pacific.
Ahead of them lay a terrifying 8-month journey across some of the world's roughest oceans.
On the 13th of July, 1771, Endeavour dropped anchor off the coast of Kent. She'd been away for almost 3 years.
Her hold was filled with paintings, animals and objects from the places they'd visited, along with over 30,000 plant specimens. In all, Banks had discovered 1,400 new species and increased the number known to science by a massive 10%. As for Cook, he'd charted 8,000 miles of coastline and single-handedly filled in almost all the blanks in the map of the world.
The Admiralty wanted to keep their exploits secret, but it wasn't long before news of their adventures leaked out, and Cook and Banks were celebrated everywhere. Captain James Cook paved the way for the expansion of the British Empire, although he would never again sail in the ship that had made it possible.
Endeavour was sold in 1775 and renamed Lord Sandwich II. The following year, she made her final transatlantic voyage, transporting British troops to the east coast of America during the War of Independence. And in the shallow waters of a Rhode Island harbour, she was unceremoniously sunk to block advancing French ships who were coming to help the Americans. And she's still there today, slowly rotting away beneath the waves. Captain Cook's luck ran out on his 3rd and final voyage. While he's in Hawaii, relations with the islanders soured after the theft of a ship's boat. A scuffle broke out when Cook tried to take the local leader hostage. Cook was stabbed and killed.
But his legacy seems destined to go on forever. In homage to his incredible mission, a timber fragment thought to be from Endeavour was placed on board the last NASA shuttle to be sent into space.
The name of that space shuttle was, of course, the Endeavour. It is a phenomenal testament to a Yorkshire farm boy who rose through the ranks to pull off one of the most wildly ambitious scientific explorations in history. And he couldn't have done it without a humble coal freighter, whose very name has become a byword for bold exploration: Endeavour.
Extraordinary, iconic, lethal. These incredible ships have told our story for the past 400 years and defined what it means to be part of our island nation. I'm Rob Bell, and in this series, I'll be exploring Britain's greatest ships. This time, I discover the extraordinary story of the Mayflower, the ship that brought the Pilgrims to the New World. The story of her voyage is one of hardship, desperation, and survival against the odds.
I mean, this is literally life or death.
And one which ultimately leads to the birth of the United States of America.
Here at the Mystic Shipyard in Connecticut is a replica of the ship that brought the first Pilgrims to the USA, the Mayflower II.
Fully seagoing and constructed to the same scale as the original. This British-built vessel brought back to life one of the most important ships in American history. But right now it's in dry dock, undergoing extensive restorations to be ready for 2020, the 400th anniversary of the Mayflower's fateful voyage to America.
The Mayflower is what's called a carrack, a type of merchant sailing ship that first appeared in the 14th century. And it's surprisingly small, at just 106 feet long and 25 feet wide.
It's a marvel of craftsmanship, built using traditional methods.
But it's tried and tested and capable of braving the seas and even the oceans.
Little is known about the early life of the original Mayflower, but we do know that her first recorded voyage almost ends in disaster. August 1609. The Mayflower and her skipper, Master Christopher Jones, have been hired to transport a cargo of goods from London to Norway. But during the voyage, the Mayflower encounters a ferocious storm in the North Sea. To make matters worse, she's overloaded and sitting low in the water.
The Fierce weather threatens to swamp the Mayflower, and Jones takes desperate action to try and save his floundering ship. He dumps most of his cargo overboard to lighten the load.
The ship is saved, but at a cost. Master Jones is taken to court to recover the losses from the jettisoned cargo. For the next 10 years, he appears to avoid taking to the high seas in the Mayflower. But for reasons unknown, a decade later, the skipper agrees to gamble his ship on a far more high-risk proposition. It's a decision that will ultimately change the world.
In early 1620, he's approached by a group of men who want to charter his ship for a desperate mission. Their bid to flee across the Atlantic to the New World will push the Mayflower and her crew to their very limits.
The men who hire the Mayflower are from a group of religious separatists who are now known as the Pilgrims. And they're fleeing the wrath of the Church of England.
The Pilgrims just didn't feel that they should have to follow the rules of someone else's church, and so as a result, they were persecuted. In some cases, their homes were destroyed. In some cases, they were jailed. They were made to feel that if they stayed, it would be a very, very dangerous situation. So they felt it was time to try and escape.
In 1609, the Pilgrims seek refuge in the Netherlands, where they're allowed to practice their religion in peace. But life in their adopted Dutch home isn't peaceful for long.
Spain was starting to threaten the Netherlands, and they were very, very afraid that if Spain did invade in the Netherlands, they would be persecuted again.
The Pilgrims believe that the only place they'll be able to practice their religion without fear of persecution is in the New World. But in the early 17th century, attempting to colonize America is fraught with danger. England's existing colonies are not faring well. At Jamestown, barely 20% of the population are still alive, and all the inhabitants at Roanoke have vanished without trace.
Despite these risks, the Puritan Pilgrims feel that they have no choice but to colonize the New World. In July 1620, the Mayflower departs London for the New World. The crew of the Mayflower have little idea that on the voyage ahead, they'll face sabotage, attempted mutiny, and death.
In 1620, sailing to North America from Europe was about as dangerous as flying an Apollo rocket to the moon. The 3,000-mile stretch of the Atlantic Ocean was a formidable obstacle, where unpredictable weather and currents could easily wreck a wooden ship, and reports of vessels vanishing without a trace were frighteningly common.
But one group desperate enough to cross these dangerous waters are the Pilgrims, religious dissidents fleeing persecution in England. They want to colonize America, where they hope to establish a new home.
Of course, the Pilgrims couldn't just pitch up in America and start a colony. They needed permission, and the permission had been granted in 1606 by King James for colonies to be set up in the New World in Virginia.
In 1620, the territory of Virginia stretches from what is now New Jersey down to Cape Fear in the Carolinas. The king grants assent for the Pilgrims to establish a colony in the northernmost part of the territory, not far from where New York City is today. With permission in place, the Pilgrims need to borrow money to fund the expedition. And this loan comes with strings attached. First, they'll have to work for free for 7 years to repay it. And secondly, they'll have to take outsiders with them to the New World.
Unknown to our pilgrims, other colonists had been advertised for, attracted to go to the New World, and these were, let's say, economic migrants, termed strangers, because they weren't of the same religious persuasion.
With permission and funding in place, the Pilgrims hire Master Christopher Jones and his ship, the Mayflower, to take them to the New World. They also purchase a second ship for the voyage, the Speedwell. The Speedwell is a pinnace, a smaller type of merchant ship able to carry 60 tons. She will transport the Pilgrims from Holland to England. The plan is for both ships crammed full of passengers to leave the south coast of England, head across the Atlantic, and arrive at the mouth of the Hudson River before the end of summer.
When they do leave Southampton on the 5th of August, they barely make it 100 miles before the Speedwell springs a serious leak.
They're forced to pull into Dartmouth Harbour to carry out urgent repairs.
The delays caused by the repairs are putting the entire endeavour in serious jeopardy. They only have a narrow fair weather window in early summer before the ferocious Atlantic storms sweep in through September.
Much of what we know about the Mayflower's voyage comes from a journal written by one of the Pilgrims' leaders, William Bradford. He's frustrated with the Speedwell. She is as open and leaky as a sieve, and there was a board that a man might have pulled off with his fingers. In late August, another attempt is made.
But this time, 300 miles in, the Speedwell starts taking on water again.
And Bradford suspects sabotage.
There's speculation the crew had got cold feet, that they decided that they didn't want to make that crossing and were trying to figure out a way to get out of their contract. The crew had put in masts that were too large for the ship, which, if you think about a mast being stuck down through the hull, it acts like a giant lever when the pressure of the sails is on the ship. Too much pressure will work those seams open on the hull and allow the ship to leak badly. At that point, they decide this boat is not worth the extra time and expense it's going to take to fix. Let's leave it behind and let's travel to the New World without it.
This leaves the mission in a perilous state. Many of the Speedwell's passengers are now crammed onto the Mayflower. The odds of success seem slim at best.
But many on board have already sold their homes and most of their worldly possessions to start new lives in America. They simply have no choice but to press on. And so, with supplies diminished and with the weather turning against them, on the 6th of September 1620, the Mayflower set sail from Plymouth, England, on her own, overloaded and 2 months behind schedule.
Christopher Jones's ship was designed to carry cargo, not passengers. So what was life on the Mayflower like during its transatlantic voyage?
This main deck, the forecastle and the poop deck up there, is where the Mayflower's crew of around 30 men would have lived and worked.
The crew might have been crammed onto this small area. But below decks, conditions for the 102 colonists are far worse.
With the Mayflower's hold full of supplies, and the main deck too dangerous for inexperienced sailors, the gun deck was the only safe place for passengers to be. But just look at the dimensions of this space. And with so many people crammed in, you can imagine what a hellish experience that must have been for them.
The circumstances aboard ship are very damp, very unclean. And to be placed between decks in cramped conditions, and they are having to figure out, how do we live in these shipboard circumstances?
But the Pilgrims are about to face a much bigger challenge. The Mayflower has missed her fair weather window, and by the time she reaches the mid-Atlantic, she's being battered by massive storms.
Seasickness is rife on board, and you can scarcely imagine the horror and the squalor of life below deck in these conditions.
For some of the passengers, it becomes too much, and they head to the main deck, only to find themselves in mortal danger. It's a decision that almost costs a young pilgrim named John Howland his life.
John Howland is up on deck and is swept overboard into the sea. And John Howland, in that churning sea, is able to grab onto one of the ropes, and they are able to pull him out that way, more dead than alive. And this is where one life is so critically important. Had John Howland died in that transatlantic storm, we would have no Bush family. We would have no Humphrey Bogarts. We would have no certain Roosevelts. There are right now 2.5 million Americans living descended from John Howland and his wife.
The storms are taking their toll on the ship itself, smashing and battering the hull of the Mayflower.
For Master Christopher Jones, braving these tempests in a heavily laden Mayflower must have brought back memories of when he almost lost the ship in a storm in the North Sea over a decade earlier.
And it isn't long before his worst fears are realized.
In early October, a massive storm hammers the Mayflower and cracks one of her central beams. I mean, just imagine the force it would take to break one of these. Those on board fear that the ship is about to be torn apart and beg for Jones to turn around and head back to England.
And they're right. One more big wave could break the Mayflower's back and sink her.
The ship's carpenter knows that the Mayflower's been critically weakened, but doesn't have a piece of wood large enough on board to attempt a repair. Out of desperation, he searches the ship's cargo hold and comes across something like this: a jack screw. The Pilgrims brought a jack screw along with them to help them construct buildings once they arrived in the New World. Now it works very simply. Let's lift this up. When I turn this handle here, and I crank that round, this metal platform here raises up. So then as my timber here comes into contact with something above, and it exerts a pressure upwards. So by wedging one end of the jack screw against the deck, the carpenter could raise the broken beam back into place, which enabled him to fashion a repair that would allow the Mayflower to continue her voyage.
But it's painfully slow going, with the Mayflower spending countless days riding the violent ocean, drifting wherever the currents take her.
After a punishing 66 days at sea, land is finally sighted on the 9th of November, 1620.
They've arrived in America.
And miraculously, despite the storms and the squalid conditions, there have only been 2 deaths during the voyage, and 1 birth. A baby boy named Oceanus was born on board.
But the Mayflower's passengers are in bad shape. After 3 months of being confined to her gun deck, many are now sick, and vital supplies such as food are running desperately low. Any joy they might feel at the sight of land is to be short-lived. Battling the storms has sent the Mayflower off course, and she's arrived off the coast of what is now Cape Cod in New England, 200 miles north of where they have permission to build their colony.
Not only do they not have permission to settle here, but this area is also known to be home to tribes of Native Americans who have reason to be hostile to the English.
But the Mayflower is in no condition to brave another risky sea voyage.
On the 11th of November 1620, the Mayflower limps into Provincetown Harbour, Cape Cod. She's now trapped between deadly seas and aggressive tribes, with supplies and morale running dangerously low. And then, dark rumours begin spreading among the passengers on board.
One group on board, economic migrants known as the Strangers, are becoming mutinous.
Without a royal charter to settle this area, they feel that they should be released of all obligations, including their 7 years of indentured servitude. They consider themselves free men and threaten to seize the Mayflower to go wherever they please.
The other group of passengers, religious dissidents known as the Pilgrims, see this rebellion as leading to catastrophe for all. And their solution to quell the unrest is nothing short of revolutionary.
It was at this point that our pilgrims got together and formed a document, the Mayflower Compact.
The original Mayflower Compact has been lost to history, but the Pilgrim diarist William Bradford recorded its contents.
It's a blueprint, if you like, of the way that they would live and conduct themselves, how they were to settle any disagreements, whereby the majority decision held. The Mayflower Compact must surely be one of the most important documents in American history, because enshrined in that are the very first tentative moves towards democracy.
And it's on board the Mayflower that all 41 men, Pilgrim and stranger alike, signed this historic document and avert the threat of mutiny. Now, the united colonists need to find somewhere to establish a home. The shallow waters of Cape Cod are too risky to navigate in the Mayflower. So the Pilgrims will need another kind of vessel to explore the New World.
This is a reproduction 17th century shallop. It's very similar to the shallop that the Pilgrims brought with them on the Mayflower. They were what I like to call the pickup truck of the 17th century. They were multi-use vehicles. You could use them for transportation for people. You could carry cargo with them. The shallop that they brought on the Mayflower was an entirely open boat, but had a whole series of these kinds of benches running down the length. You could row a shallop with 6 or 8 men. They used the shallop to explore the inner arm of the Cape when they were looking for a place to settle, and it was an important part of the Pilgrim story.
The shallop allows the Pilgrims to finally leave the Mayflower and begin exploring this strange new land.
The classic image is that of them stepping ashore wearing tall hats, these large white collars, dressed mainly in black. Almost like a group of people done up in their Sunday best. But evidence recently discovered paints a very different picture.
Having undertaken this desperate voyage to flee religious persecution, the Pilgrims are ready to secure their future by any means necessary.
Bradford in his journal, he describes men running out with their coats of mail on not too long after getting to Cape Cod. So we know for sure this was here, but we also have a complete armor light.
Can we have a look at that?
Of course, yeah, pick it up. That weighs about...
It's got the back plate as well?
Yeah. So you've got tassets, which protect the thighs.
Jeez.
You've got the breastplate, and altogether this weighs probably about 15 pounds.
This is kind of heavy-duty equipment at the time that you would have expected in full-blown war.
So north of here, you had the French settling. South of here, in what's now New York, you had the Dutch. Further south from there, all the way almost the other coast of America, you had the Spanish, all of whom were saying, this is our land, so get out. So they expected to also potentially have to fight with native people.
Let's try it on here.
Sure.
Right. There you go, that's
So-
on. You know, actually, being in this as well, it does really give me a new perspective on the Pilgrims, because yes, they may have been religious, but they were coming over here and they needed to protect themselves, and they were willing to do so.
Absolutely. This is literally life or death.
The Pilgrims came to the New World fully prepared if it came to a fight. The most deadly weapon in their arsenal was the musket.
This voyage west to the New World was all about survival. And it wasn't long after the Pilgrims arrived that their muskets were used in anger, in conflict.
In early December, an expedition party leaves the Mayflower on the shallop, unaware that they're about to have a close encounter with one of the native tribes who inhabit this region.
The Pilgrims come ashore near a village belonging to the Norset people. As they approach the settlement, they catch fleeting glimpses of people disappearing into the tree line. But those figures don't stay hidden in the shadows for long.
With darkness fast approaching, the expedition party is unable to make it back to the safety of the Mayflower, and they set up camp. During the night, their sleep is repeatedly interrupted by eerie cries.
The Norset attack the encampment at first light with a hail of arrows. The startled Pilgrims hastily grab their muskets and from the cover of their camp, return fire.
But this attack by the Norset tribe isn't entirely unprovoked. Darius Coombs, a leader of the Wampanoag people, another tribe native to this region, explains why.
A lot of people think that was the first time we ever seen Europeans here, and that's not the case. 6 years prior, there was an English captain named Thomas Hunt that came down the coast and took 19 Wampanoag as slaves and went down the Nauset and took 7 Nauset as slaves.
Probably not surprising that there was conflict.
There was conflict. There were musket balls fired, there was arrows that fired. Nobody got killed but it wasn't a pleasant sight.
The Pilgrims retreat back to the relative safety of the Mayflower and must look elsewhere for a location to establish their colony. But over a month of exploration proves fruitless. And then winter arrives.
They urgently now need to find a suitable location to establish their colony. But the brutal New England weather is hampering exploration, and there are only a few people fit enough to leave the ship in these conditions. What they need is a miracle, and during Christmas 1620, they get one.
The weary exploration team arrive at an abandoned native village. It has everything they need to establish a colony.
Legend has it that the Pilgrims set ashore right by this boulder here. Now, this location had already been given a name on the map by earlier explorers, and coincidentally, that name is the same as the port from which the Pilgrims left England, Plymouth. This boulder has become known as Plymouth Rock, and it's visited by thousands of people from all over the world every year. But just over there, the colonists began construction of the settlement that would change the course of American history.
Plymouth is located in Cape Cod Bay, in what is now the state of Massachusetts. And on Christmas Day 1620, the Pilgrims lay their very first foundations.
And this is where they began to build.
It was originally called First Street and later renamed Leyden Street after the Pilgrims' Dutch home in exile.
This is the oldest continually inhabited street in the entire United States. But when the Pilgrims first arrived, there was nothing much here at all. This was just a barren, frozen hill in an unforgiving land, which meant that the cramped and squalid conditions of the Mayflower would have to be their home for a while longer.
But disease and death are now stalking the ship.
Living for more than half a year on the Mayflower has taken a tragic toll. By the end of that first winter in New England, less than half of the 102 colonists are still alive.
Imagine what it's like to be with people where entire families are disappearing from the face of the earth. That in February and early March, we know sometimes 2 or 3 people a day were dying.
It was called the Winter of Death by William Bradford. He felt that, that it had maybe been a mistake.
And just when it seems the future couldn't be any more bleak, the native people return.
On the 16th of March, a man named Samoset boldly walks into the Plymouth settlement. The urgent question for the Pilgrims, is he friend or foe?
His name was Samoset. He came into the Pilgrim village and said, "Welcome, Englishmen."
And what is very, very welcoming to the English.
That was the first forms of diplomacy right there. And he goes, "I'm not from here, basically, and I'm going to bring you a leader who is." And he brought Massasoit, a very powerful Wampanoag leader, and Massasoit brought 60 of his men.
Massasoit is the sachem, the high chief of all the Wampanoag people. His nation is under threat from rival chiefs, so Massasoit approaches the Pilgrims with a deal in mind.
He needed an ally, so he was smart enough to come out here and make an alliance with the colonists and made that very famous treaty between the two people.
So the colonists, what then, formed this treaty with the Wampanoag nation? How successful was that?
But between the two people, there was no major conflict, no major bloodshed or war for over 50 years.
But for the Pilgrims, struggling to scratch out an existence in this unforgiving land, this treaty achieves far more than preventing violence.
Because of this cooperation between the indigenous people and our settlers, it was the difference between survival and dying. There was an exchange of skills, how to hunt, what crops to grow, how to grow them, and without that, the colony most likely would not have survived.
With the arrival of spring, it's time for Christopher Jones and his ship, the Mayflower, to return to England. Their job of bringing the Pilgrims to America is now complete. They wait for a break in the weather to set sail.
Fair winds finally arrive on the 5th of April 1621, and Master Jones sets sail for England, 6 months after arriving in the New World. He leaves with the knowledge that the future of the Pilgrims at Plymouth Colony now seems more certain. But as he departs the Americas, he doesn't suspect that both his future and that of the Mayflower will be cut tragically short.
Blessed with fair weather and favourable westerly winds, the Mayflower arrives back in London on the 6th of May, 1621, just 31 days after departing from the Plymouth colony.
Despite the Mayflower's vital role in establishing the first English colony in New England, there's no public interest in her return. And she glides back into London without fanfare. For both the ship and her skipper, Master Christopher Jones, after braving the hardship and the deprivation of New England, it's back to business as usual, but only for a short time.
Christopher Jones dies suddenly, just 11 months after returning from the New World. And by 1624, the Mayflower lies rotting on the mudflats of Rotherhithe. The ship is valued at only £128, far short of the thousands she would have cost to build.
The final damning words on the appraisal describe the Mayflower as in ruinous, meaning that she's likely to be broken up and sold for scrap. A sad fate for a ship that changed the course of world history.
But what happened at Plymouth Colony ensures that the Mayflower won't be forgotten.
With the help of the native Wampanoag people, the colony here at Plymouth not only survived, it thrived. The crops they planted that spring brought in a bumper harvest, which led to one of the most important events in American history.
The Pilgrim diarist William Bradford records that late in 1621, a great 3-day feast takes place in celebration. The 50 surviving pilgrims are joined by over 90 Wampanoag men, women and children. This feast becomes known as the first Thanksgiving meal.
Not only is Bradford's diary an important record that leads to the Thanksgiving holiday, it's also the document that informs the world about the Mayflower and her crucial role in founding the nation that will become the United States of America.
But for hundreds of years, there was nothing to celebrate the Mayflower's amazing legacy. All that changes in 1955.
The good ship Mayflower comes back to America.
When Great Britain builds an exact replica as a gift to America for her aid in the Second World War. But the shipbuilders encounter a problem. No plans or drawings of this iconic ship are known to exist. Fortunately, in the 1920s, British maritime historian Dr. Roger Charles Anderson constructed this, the very first scale model of the Mayflower, on which the design of Mayflower 2 would be based.
It's so detailed, it's absolutely stunning.
Anderson wanted to make certain, in many ways, that it almost was a working vessel. This is truly rigged. These deck boards are individual planks made of Spanish chestnut, and each one is fashioned with a tiny, tiny little wooden peg, a tree nail, just the way an authentic ship would have been. There are 1,500 tree nails in this deck.
And there wouldn't, I guess, have been a huge range of designs of those types of ships at that time.
Absolutely. Anderson, he was making a Mayflower model that would represent the ordinary merchant vessel of about the same size and about the same age as we knew the Mayflower to be.
In April 1957, the Mayflower 2 departs from England, recreating the voyage of her ancestor.
Historic Plymouth Rock greets the replica of a famous ship, and an historic trip comes to an end.
The Mayflower 2 has been moored in Plymouth Plantation ever since, attracting hundreds of thousands of visitors every year. Not surprisingly, after 60 years of being blasted by Atlantic weather, the ship needs a refit. Now, after an intensive overhaul, it's almost ready to set sail again. Leading the restoration is Mayflower 2's captain, Whit Perry.
It's a multi-million-dollar, multi-year restoration to the Mayflower, and it's so exciting because it's such an iconic historic vessel for so many people.
When this whole project is finished, can you imagine now what that's going to feel like for you to see this ship in all of its glory?
To be able to sail this ship after this restoration and have it fully operational and take part in the 400th commemoration ceremonies, it will be incredible.
And the legacy of the Mayflower and the pilgrims she brought to the New World is still felt in American society today.
It was the Mayflower Pilgrims that got on that creaky, horrible old merchant's boat, which never should have had people on it, and sailed to America to create a world that no one could ever have dreamed possible. They changed all of Western civilization.
So this vessel that carried them here, I think, is very symbolically important to many facets of our American identity, which is based on immigration and arrival.
I have worked at a living history museum that tells this story for 30 years now, and again, new Americans will come up to me and say, I came from Venezuela 17 years ago for a better life here in the United States. This is my story too.
When Master Christopher Jones agreed to sail the Pilgrims to the New World, not in his wildest dreams would he have imagined that his simple English merchant ship would play such a vital role in founding the richest nation on Earth. You know, I can't help but wonder how he'd feel about the commemorations planned for the 400th anniversary of his voyage. I think he'd be rather pleased. Extraordinary, iconic, lethal.
These incredible ships have told our story for the past 400 years and defined what it means to be part of our island nation. I'm Rob Bell, and in this series, I'll be exploring Britain's greatest ships. In this episode, I tell the amazing story of the Royal Research ship Discovery, a ship that set sail on a voyage to the last uncharted continent on the planet, Antarctica.
The equivalent in our age was going to the moon. There's no two ways around it.
A journey that would attract the world's most famous explorers.
Shackleton became just desperate. He wanted to be part of this expedition.
Discovery was the first ever purpose-built scientific vessel, and she ignited a global passion for exploration.
Designed to withstand the harshest conditions on the planet, the Royal Research ship Discovery was the strongest ship ever built when she was launched. She was a ship conceived for one mission, an expedition that would capture the imagination of the world, a journey to the uncharted South Pole.
Not only did this ship have to travel through the roughest seas imaginable and traverse the thick pack ice of the Antarctic, she also had to be a base camp for expeditions, a laboratory for scientific discovery, and a home to protect her crew.
Discovery's mission reignited Britain's passion for exploration and would make two of her crew members the world's most famous explorers. Two men who, with their determination to explore Antarctica, would become bitter rivals, Robert Falcon Scott and Ernest Shackleton.
At the end of the 19th century, the Antarctic was the last great uncharted continent on the planet. But in the years running up to Scott's famous journey, the idea of a polar expedition was seen as an extravagant folly. The last mission to the Antarctic had taken place over 50 years earlier and had been led entirely by the Royal Navy.
Ross's 1839 expedition had been a success, but had cost the Navy hundreds of thousands of pounds for not very much in return. British naval power was needed elsewhere, and polar expeditions were seen as dangerous, expensive, and futile.
But one man wouldn't take no for an answer. The head of the Royal Geographic Society, Sir Clement Markham. He was determined to see a British expedition take on Antarctica. And when Markham managed to raise money from private backers, the Navy didn't want to be left out and decided to match his funds.
With funding secured, now a ship was needed. It would have to weather the harsh winter, surrounded by sheet ice, so it would need to be robust. But first and foremost, it had to be a scientific research vessel.
And as the ship would be conducting incredibly detailed magnetic surveys, it created the first dilemma for the shipbuilders.
If I was here on a metal-hulled ship, a compass would be thrown off by all the iron and steel around. In fact, the scientists on board Discovery were so worried about the effects on their magnetic equipment that when they discovered the cushions in the saloon here had metal buttons, they ordered them all to be replaced.
Not having an iron hull was a huge problem. To survive a winter in the Antarctic, the ship would have to be incredibly strong to resist the crushing pressure caused by the freezing ice.
When water freezes, its volume expands by almost 10%. Now, this is a real problem if you're in a boat, because as water freezes, it wants to expand into the space your boat is occupying. Well, here's one I froze earlier. And you can see that the freezing of the water as it turned into ice has actually expanded and put pressure on the hull of the ship and actually crushed that hull of the ship. Not what you want in the middle of a frozen ocean.
To counter the effect of the ice, Discovery wouldn't just have to be the strongest wooden ship, but the strongest ship ever built out of any material. And over 100 years later, it's a testament to the builder's expertise that this ship is still afloat, here on Dundee's quayside. But in 1899, finding a company to build the ship was proving difficult.
One of the main problems when you're looking to build a wooden ship in the start of the 1900s is simply that so many of the shipyards around the world had now moved on to metal, and the skills just were not there. This was not a dead industry, but it was certainly in decline.
There was only one place in the whole of Great Britain that still built wooden ships: Dundee. And that's because a huge part of this city's economy back in the 19th century relied on whaling. Whales provided loads of stuff, from fuel for street lamps, support for ladies' corsets, even handles for knives and forks. You couldn't get away from it. And the best whaling grounds were out and up towards the Arctic, where ships risked being trapped in the ice.
This 100-year-old industry had learnt the hard way how to build a ship that could navigate the ice flows of the Arctic.
Wooden ships were tried and tested in the polar regions. They were known to be strong enough and flexible enough to survive the extreme conditions they would face. And so if you're looking for building a ship that's going to manage to survive, hopefully being trapped into the ice, you follow the tried and tested route.
But the unknown waters of the Antarctic would test even these shipbuilders. As a precaution, the hull was over 2 feet thick in places, making her stronger than any ship that had gone before her.
One downside of this design is that you couldn't have portholes looking out, as they'd compromise the strength of the hull. So to let light and air down into the lower decks, they came up with these mushroom vents. Although the crew were quick to rename them ankle bashers. No prizes for guessing why.
With the shipbuilding well underway, Markham looked for a man to lead the expedition.
Markham wrote in his diary that he wanted a naval officer in the regular line, young and a good sailor with experience of ships under sail. He must have imagination and enthusiasm, be calm, yet quick and decisive in action. Little did he know that he'd met the man he was looking for 12 years earlier.
At the age of 18, a young naval cadet, Robert Falcon Scott, had won a clipper race in the West Indies when Markham happened to be watching.
There's no doubt Markham kept a very sharp eye on the young officers of the Royal Navy, and he said that Scott was on his shortlist.
And as Markham was whittling down that shortlist, he bumped into Scott in London. This was the first time Scott had heard of the expedition, and 2 days after the chance meeting, sent a letter volunteering to command the ship.
Scott was made captain of Discovery in June 1900. And for such an arduous mission ahead, he was careful to handpick every member of crew himself, all bar one. The third officer was chosen by the expedition's backers. His name was Ernest Shackleton.
Shackleton had joined the Merchant Navy at the age of 16 and had progressed quickly through the ranks.
Shackleton was made aware of the expedition and became just desperate. He had to be on this. He wanted to be part of this expedition.
In the Merchant Navy, officers had to treat their crew with more leniency, as they could easily jump ship. But Scott, with his Royal Navy background, was more of a disciplinarian, And these two leadership styles were fundamentally at odds and destined for conflict.
Captain Scott now had his crew. They were all ready to go, but the ship wasn't.
And this was a big problem, as the ship had to be in Antarctica before the winter set in.
The only way to avoid this would be to minimize Discovery's sea trials, a period of intense testing to find all of her problems and iron them out before going out on a long voyage. This decision would put the entire crew's lives at risk on her very first voyage. Discovery was the strongest ship ever built, with her hull of solid wood, ideal for dealing with the ice sheets and icebergs she'd meet on her mission to Antarctica. But on the first leg of her journey, shortcuts to reach the South Pole before the Antarctic winter had put the ship in a precarious position.
Not long after leaving Dundee, 6 feet of water had seeped into the ship's hold, coming through some badly sealed joints in the planking.
With no place or time to stop, Scott and his crew were forced to carry out emergency repairs whilst at sea. Now, this involved a process called caulking. And to do caulking, you need some of this stuff called oakum, which is hemp, like what they use to make ropes that's been treated. And then, using a mallet and an iron, like this, you'd wedge the oakum down into the gap between the planks that needed sealing. But of course, these emergency repairs were far from ideal. And until they reached land in New Zealand, Scott and his crew would have to hope that this lasted.
Incredibly, after an 11,000-mile journey through the roughest seas on the planet, the makeshift repairs had held strong. The ship limped into Lyttelton Harbour, where she was immediately sent to dry dock to properly seal the planks. As the ship was being worked on, Scott turned his attention to buying all the supplies they would need.
Captain Scott ordered up the provisions for at least 3 years. And some of those included, let's have a look here. We've got sledges, tents, furs, alcohol, aptly described as medical comforts.
As well as taking on stores in New Zealand, Scott had to bring on board some new crew. 7 sailors had been dismissed for not meeting Scott's high standards.
One of their replacements was a young man named Clarence Hare. He was a clerk and had no experience of life at sea, but he longed for adventure and signed up on the spot. His role was to act as Scott's personal steward, but in his spare time, he struck up a friendship with the sledge dogs on board, something that was against the direct orders of the ship's officers.
These were not pets. They were working animals, here to help Scott conquer the Antarctic.
Dogs have been used to pull sleds for over 1,000 years, starting with natives of Alaska and northern Canada. And today, I'm going to give it a go.
Amazingly, dog sleds were still the preferred method of transport in the Antarctic right up until the 1970s.
What is it about this breed of dog then, these huskies, that makes them so good for pulling sleds?
Siberian Huskies have been doing this for the last 2,000 years, so through evolution and selective breeding, they chose the dogs that didn't need to eat too much food. They had the big thick coat, so they were very efficient. They weren't losing energy, so they could keep themselves insulated. They're incredibly light on their feet, so they cover a lot of distance without expending a lot of energy.
These dogs are trained to pull sleds. All they want to do is run. And you can see and you can hear how excited they are now they know they're actually going to go out for a run. I think I'm good, am I? Strap in? Oh, I am definitely putting my seatbelt on here. Let's go!
This is top speed down that bit there.
Scott had been advised to take Siberian Huskies by Norwegian explorer Nansen, as they were the breed best suited to the extreme conditions of the Antarctic.
Oh, good turn. Wow.
On board Discovery, Scott had taken 23 dogs in total, which were all encouraged to breed freely on the long journey over. After 3 weeks in New Zealand, Discovery finally set sail for the Antarctic on the 21st of December 1901. The deck of Discovery was a hive of activity. The ship was packed with 3 years' worth of supplies, including live animals. Among all this madness, one man could be found quietly painting the Antarctic vista in front of him. Edward Wilson.
My great-uncle was Dr. Edward Wilson, who was the vertebrate zoologist and artist on the Discovery expedition and the junior doctor. But his principal job was collecting specimens and painting them and preparing them for the museums back home. Various other little jobs he picked up along the way. At one point he was the wine caterer because he didn't drink, so he could be trusted to make sure everyone got a fair measure and he wasn't drinking the wine bottles on the quiet.
Within 2 weeks, land was sighted, and Scott carefully selected a mooring to house the ship for the long, cold winter, a place he aptly named Winter Quarters Bay.
Scott knew that the freezing pack ice would put a huge pressure on Discovery's hull. So the plan was to moor the ship directly into the ice shelf. If he could blast out a hole in the ice using explosives, he could then moor the ship directly into the gap he'd created. As this ice was already frozen, it wouldn't expand anymore, and the ship would be protected on 3 sides.
Scott's plan worked, and the ship was safely docked in its icy port. As the regular crew set about building a base of wooden huts, it was time for the scientists to get to work.
Working from this custom-built onboard laboratory, the ship's biologist, Thomas Hodgson, discovered 500 new species, including marine animals, spiders, shrimps and shellfish. But if he wanted to dissect something larger, like a seal maybe, he'd commandeer this table here in the wardroom. Officers then would often be eating their meals where a large marine mammal had just been taken apart just hours before.
The scientists all had officer rank and were treated to certain luxuries, but one perk soon turned into a poisoned chalice.
The officers on board Discovery had their own private cabins. The only downside of this was that without the extra body heat from other men around, these spaces got incredibly cold. Ice would frequently form on the walls, and Scott reported that when he was working at his desk, he had to bury his feet in a box of straw to keep them warm.
Despite the extreme cold, naval etiquette was still observed.
For the officers, dinner in the wardroom was quite a formal affair. They ate off specially commissioned Royal Dalton china, using specially commissioned silver cutlery. And to Scott's surprise, apart from the odd glass of wine, there was very little alcohol consumed. And every Tuesday, they'd hold a debate. It could be a scientific subject one week, something more topical the next. All very civilized indeed.
There was lots of different things that the men did to amuse themselves. They put on theatrical performances in the hut where they were all dressed up. All sorts of different activities, sports days out on the ice where they play all sorts of games and things and win prizes. And one of the key things was the South Polar Times.
The South Polar Times was a newspaper published on board Discovery. It was edited initially by Shackleton and later by Scott, and it was a means of recording events and news on board the ship, and a way of publishing articles and giving information, a bit of entertainment for the crew. We've got some events of the months here. Where are we? July 27th, Snowball, one of the dogs, gave birth to 4 pups. You can see how something like this would have made a massive difference to what was otherwise monotony on board.
As the Antarctic summer fast approached, Scott could relieve the men's boredom by getting them prepared for the ship's real mission, exploration. Suited and booted, the men set out on the Antarctic ice. But it quickly became apparent that the crew had gravely underestimated the Antarctic conditions. Blizzards were intense, and the all-white vista meant that men could get lost just 30 yards away from the ship. And on the 11th of March, the crew were confronted with the life and death stakes of polar exploration.
A party was returning from a sledge mission when they were struck by a blizzard 10 miles from Discovery. The men were ordered to abandon their tents, their sledges, and even their dogs to try and make a dash back to the ship. The snowfall was so heavy they could barely see 2 yards ahead of them. And on a descent down a steep slope, 2 men disappeared and were given up for dead. George Vince and Scott's own steward, Clarence Hare. It seemed as though the Antarctic had taken its first 2 victims.
The Royal Research Ship Discovery was designed and constructed to withstand the most inhospitable environment on the planet, the Antarctic. But in March 1902, 2 men found themselves 10 miles from the safety of Discovery, caught in a blizzard and given up for dead.
So Clarence Hare was a late addition to the expedition. He was a clerk and had no previous polar experience, no previous sailing experience. This was a man who just was excited by the chance to go.
On the 11th of March, Clarence found himself separated from his mates, with no equipment to build a camp or even light a fire. He knew his chances for survival were slim. Lonely and discouraged, he sat down to die and let himself drift off to sleep in the snow. But whilst his crew had given up on him, one of his friends refused to do so.
In a howling blizzard with temperatures dropping to -60, Clarence lay dying. But extraordinarily, his favourite dog, Kit, managed to find him and, by snuggling in next to him, provided just enough heat for Clarence to survive the night. In the morning, Kit licked his face until he regained consciousness and then helped guide him back to the ship, where Clarence went on to make a full recovery. His crewmate, George Vince, was never seen again. His disappearance reminded the men of the real dangers of polar exploration. But Scott had his orders and was keen to press on with Discovery's mission. He wanted to explore the Great Ice Barrier and the frozen desert beyond. For the journey, he'd need 19 dogs, pulling 5 sleds laden with supplies, and 2 brave men. Scott knew that one of the men joining him had to be the ship's assistant surgeon and his best friend on board, Dr. Wilson.
Uncle Ted knew it was the greatest honour on the ship. Everybody wanted it. But he also had mixed feelings because they'd just discovered emperor penguins breeding, and he really thought he ought to be out and about finding more out about those. And he thought this was going to be terribly dull in comparison with the possibility of spending time with emperor penguins.
Wilson encouraged Scott to add another man to the expedition, his 3rd lieutenant, Ernest Shackleton. The most famous trio in polar exploration had just been assembled for a trek that would almost cost them their lives.
On the 2nd of November 1902, the three men set off on the most ambitious polar expedition that had ever been attempted. Their aim was to get as far south in a straight line as they could on the barrier ice and reach the South Pole if possible.
The expedition started well, and Scott, with the help of his dogs, was making good ground. The dogs were usually full of energy and desperate to run, but after a few days, the men noticed that they were weakening and struggling to pull the heavy sleds. When they examined the dogs, they found that they were bleeding from painful sores.
The biggest problem for the dogs was the food that they were being fed. When Scott was planning the expedition, he took the advice of Nansen. And Nansen had recommended not only the dogs, but also the type of food they should take, a particular type of fish. Scott was taking the food from Norway and going south, which meant going through the tropics. This is thought to have spoiled the food in the hole, which meant they were actually poisoning them.
As the dogs got sicker and started to die, Scott had to face some tough choices.
The decision was then made that what they would do was feed the dogs who had died to the other dogs, the fitter dogs.
Scott, he loved animals, great British trait, and he didn't like the idea of killing dogs to feed to other dogs and so on. So my great uncle, being the biologist, ended up doing most of that dirty work. And they carried on until they shot the last of the dogs. And then they had to start man-hauling.
Scott, Shackleton and Wilson now had to do the work of 19 dogs, pushing the men to near exhaustion. After nearly 2 months of marching, it was the height of the Antarctic summer, Christmas Day. For the men out on the ice, it was just another long, cold day of relentless marching. But back in the warmth and safety of discovery, it was time to relax and feast.
As you may well be able to imagine in the Antarctic, turkey was in rather short supply. But there was one bird that the expedition found in abundance. On Christmas Day, the men of Discovery sat down to enjoy a dinner of roast penguin.
They ate lots and lots of penguins and huge amounts of seals. In 2 years, they killed and ate over 500 seals. Now, for us, that's horrible to think of, but for them, this is just the livestock they're able to get when they're down there. The seal meat is apparently very tasty and was a real delicacy for the men.
It had one very important feature that would protect them from a disease called scurvy.
It's caused by a lack of vitamin C in the diet, and strangely enough, the Antarctic offered a remedy. Pound for pound, seal liver has almost as much vitamin C in it as an orange.
The men on board Discovery were kept healthy on a diet of fresh seal meat, but for Scott, Shackleton and Wilson, it was a very different story.
Away from the ship, the men would have to live on this stuff. It's called pemmican. It's made up of ground up meat and mixed with fat. Now that might not sound or look too appetizing, but it had one incredibly useful quality. At room temperature, this stuff would last for up to 5 years. In freezing conditions, it was good for at least 20. Perfect for a polar expedition. Now, if the men needed a really quick energy boost, they might slice a piece off and just chomp that back. But if it was mealtime and they felt really fancy, they'd make it into a stew they called hoosh. It was quite a simple recipe. It had 3 ingredients: pemmican, sled biscuits, and melted down snow or ice. So let's give it a shot. Start to melt down my ice here. Whilst we're waiting for that ice to melt though, I'm gonna break up my pemmican here. Let's get a chunk of that off. Oh, it's quite hard actually. There we go. You can see all the bits of ground up meat within the fat here. Let's chuck that in. Hope you're watching, Delia. Then our final ingredient, we get some of these sled biscuits, which is very simply flour, butter, more fat, and a bit of salt. Hopefully a bit of flavour, kind of. Let's crumble those in there as well. All right, well that needs a bit of time on the stove there. It's actually not looking too bad. It's definitely more stew-like now. I should probably try a little bit here. It's not the worst thing I've ever had. It's not the best either. It's quite bland. It does taste quite fatty. Well, that was the point. It's about getting calories in. But for the men out on the polar expeditions, sometimes this would be all they'd eat for up to 6 months. I'm not sure I could stomach that.
Due to this limited diet on their expedition south, Shackleton was suffering from the symptoms of scurvy. He was exhausted and coughing up blood. And on the 30th of December, 1902, the expedition reluctantly decided to turn back. They'd travelled further south than any human in history. On the journey back, the expedition went from bad to disastrous. Wilson was now suffering from snow blindness and was forced to pull his sled blindfolded to ease his pain.
There is strong sunlight, reaching the snow and ice, reflecting extremely strong intensity of radiation. It feels as though you've got sandpaper on the inside of your eyelids.
Scott was faring only slightly better thanks to a simple piece of equipment. And I've been given the privilege of getting my hands on it.
And just here, I have the actual pair of goggles worn by Scott on this expedition. Be very, very careful with these. That were once worn by Scott. Oh, actually, look at this here. It's got his initials, RFS, carved in there. You can see they're made from a single piece of wood that have been carved out with these slits cut in to be able to see out of. And not only would this have severely limited his vision, but would have offered next to no UV protection at all. I mean, looking at this now, it seems incredibly basic and rudimentary.
Despite the suffering of Wilson and Shackleton, Scott couldn't afford to let the two men rest and press them as hard as he could.
Scott ordered for everything that wasn't absolutely needed to be discarded.
Amazingly, against all the odds, Scott, Shackleton and Wilson managed to march the 400 miles back to Discovery. But almost as soon as they returned, Scott saw he had a bigger problem. The Antarctic summer should have melted the pack ice, and Discovery should have been floating on the open sea.
But when he returned to the ship, he found that she was completely frozen in still, surrounded by 20 miles of ice. It looked as though Discovery would never be freed up. To free her, Scott sent teams of men to saw through the ice. Now, I've got a thick block of ice here and a saw, so let's give that a go. And Scott's men would have been doing this all day long in freezing cold conditions. And after 12 days, they'd managed to make 2 parallel cuts of 450 yards, but the open sea was still 20 miles away.
Scott knew that it was hopeless trying to free the ship and had to break the hard news to the crew that they'd be staying in the Antarctic for another long winter. But some men would return home on the relief ships.
The most famous person to have been sent home, unfortunately, was Shackleton. Shackleton did want to stay. He wanted to continue, but it was seen as a potential detriment to his health. It was a risk that they were not willing to put up with.
Scott's real motivation for sending Shackleton home has been debated by scholars for over a century. It's rumoured that Scott was furious with Shackleton when he found out that he'd hidden his scurvy symptoms before they set out on the expedition.
There have been allegations that there was a real fallout between Scott and Shackleton, and that was the reason why Shackleton was returned back.
And there are various stories about what did or didn't happen on the ice, and there's no verification because there were only 3 men who actually do know what happened on the ice, and they're all long since dead.
In the spring of 1903, Scott was keen to make the most of being stuck in the ice and planned another expedition.
So the second year, expeditions get sent out to fill in the gaps on the map to see whether the bits of land that have been discovered are separate islands, or whether they're all joined together in one huge, probable continental mass. Scott
again set off, and this time came across something completely unexpected. They came across a completely ice-free area, what's now known as the Dry Valley.
You might as well have been on Mars, except for the thicker atmosphere.
On this expedition, Scott travelled hundreds of miles, climbed thousands of feet, and collected hugely important fossils. It was the most comprehensive mapping of Antarctica that had ever taken place, and provided scientific data that's still used today.
And they do a journey which was the equivalent of the crossing of Greenland. It's one of the greatest polar journeys ever made, and nobody's ever heard of it. It's extraordinary, really.
Scott finally returned to Discovery on Christmas Eve 1903 and found that once again his ship was stuck in the ice.
2 relief ships arrived in January 1904, bringing Scott an ultimatum in a sealed telegram from the expedition's backers in London. Free the ship by the 25th of February, or leave her behind.
Scott now threw every available resource into freeing the ship, sending men with saws, pickaxes, and even explosives to break up the ice.
The problem there is you don't want to damage the hull. You can overdo the explosives. And sea ice is rather bad stuff from this point of view. It's not like freshwater ice. It'll smash and brittle like glass. It's almost bouncy, so a good bang might look spectacular but not do much work.
By the 10th of February, Discovery was still locked in the ice, with the relief ships 2 miles away.
With a heavy heart, Scott accepted that he'd have to leave his ship behind. But everything that Discovery's crew had recorded over the last 2 years was far too valuable just to be left in Antarctica. So Scott gave the order to start offloading all of the scientific equipment and samples. But then, at the last minute, Discovery was given a lifeline.
After a month of trying to hack their way through the ice, on the morning of the 14th of February, the crew woke to find that the ice had miraculously started to crack overnight. The relief ships, Terra Nova and Morning, were now able to push their way alongside Discovery.
Astonishingly, after 2 winters, her hull had escaped the whole ordeal almost entirely without damage. It had lost some of the external sheathing of green heartwood, but otherwise, the hull of the world's strongest ship was as good as the day she was launched.
Once clear of the ice, it was plain sailing home.
So when Discovery returned back to Britain in 1904, Scott and the crew were greeted as heroes. There was civic receptions laid on for them, hundreds of people there to greet them.
They were invited up to Balmoral, and they had the chance for an audience with the King. This is where Scott was finally promoted to captain. Because although he was known as Captain Scott and the men called him the captain, Scott had only just been promoted to commander for the expedition.
Publicly, Scott was the toast of the town. But behind closed doors, the government and scientific community were critical of his handling of the expedition and his failure to reach the South Pole. With the weight of expectation on his shoulders, Scott began to plan for a second expedition.
But an old colleague was about to beat him to it.
Without talking to Scott about it, Shackleton decides to launch his own expeditions. That's when it all started going very wrong.
Scott did manage to beat Shackleton to the South Pole, only to find that Norwegian explorer Roald Amundsen had got there first, just weeks earlier. Scott died on the return journey, just 11 miles from a food and fuel depot.
It's often said that Antarctica gets into your blood, and it's certainly borne out by the way Scott and Shackleton were driven to go back.
With the race to the pole over, Shackleton set his sights on being the first to cross the entire continent of Antarctica, sea to sea. But disaster struck when his ship was crushed in the ice. Shackleton decided to abandon the mission to save his crew. Undeterred, he would return to Antarctica twice more, dying 10 years later en route to his 4th expedition, one which doctors had warned against.
The names Scott and Shackleton have become synonymous with polar expeditions. Their achievements defined the golden age of British exploration and inspired a generation of explorers still to come.
And for the rest of Discovery's crew, their legacy lies in the scientific findings of the expedition.
They were able to confirm that Antarctica was a continent. They also proved that at one point Antarctica had been forested and not an ice-barren wasteland that we know it now. They changed our perception of what Antarctica actually is.
The RRS Discovery is a fantastically important British ship. It is a great British ship, inspiring on so many levels, and changed the course of the scientific history of this country.
Discovery was the strongest ship ever built at the time, and the first to survive 2 harsh polar winters. She was the base from which groundbreaking expeditions were launched, and home to 2 of Britain's most famous heroes. But her true legacy is science. She was the first purpose-built scientific ship, and her true mission was to understand, not conquer. Today, thanks to an international treaty, Antarctica can only be used for peaceful scientific purposes. And I like to think this is in no small part thanks to the way Discovery and her crew first landed there.